Please welcome to the stage Deanna Farrell, President and CEO of JPMorgan Chase Institute. Joining Deanna is the Atlantic's Rebecca Rosen.
Hi, Deanna.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming and joining us here today.
Indeed. Thank you all.
Why don't we just start by if you can tell everyone about the JPMorgan Chase Institute, what it is you guys are doing, and why it's unique and kind of all this data, all the studies that are out there, what makes this different?
I'd love to, thank you, because it is a new idea. It's a new initiative. I spent a long time at McKinsey, where I ran the McKinsey Global Institute. I spent some time in the White House trying to devise policy at the critical juncture of the financial and economic crisis. And I think a few of the things that came away from that is we don't have, through the public administration data and through a lot of the traditional economic models, all the data we need to really understand what's happening in the economy. So the initiative, this JPMorgan Chase initiative, is a global think tank dedicated to data-rich analyses and expert insights that we'll put into the public domain for the public good. But the really exciting part about it is it's what I characterize as the next generation of economic research. It's big data technology platforms with behavioral science approaches to doing data, and I'll describe that as we talk about some other work, against the body of transactions, real-time activity that is JPMorgan Chase's activities around the world in the economy. And so we really have a pulse, obviously, fully stripped of personal information, anonymized, a pulse on a lot of real-time activity that helps us understand the economic and financial well-being of households, individuals, families, of small businesses, of financial markets, and that's the core idea, which is now a year old, and I think demonstrating that we're really finding some pretty interesting things that are not possible to see well with the traditional data sources we have.
And one of those things is this major report you guys recently released on volatility and income volatility that people experience in their month-to-month incomes. And part of the reason that this is so interesting is we have a pretty good picture in the economy of how much people make in the year, but how when they earn that money shifts quite a lot month to month. What did that allow you to see, and what did you guys find when looking at income at that kind of more granular level?
So one of the important things we need to understand about how we even think we know what income and consumption of individuals are is how those data are collected. And typically, there's survey-based data that occur on an annual basis sometimes, on a slightly less than that, not necessarily longitudinal, so it's not the same people who are being interviewed over time, but very importantly, not the timeliness of it. So we get an annual view at best, sometimes a quarterly view. What we were able to do is to construct from all the inflows that we see through products and services and all the outflows that we see from products and services, a monthly income and consumption tally. And we were surprised, even relative to some of the academic literature out there, to find how extensive is the degree to which Americans across the board are facing volatility. So 70% or more Americans will have at least a 5% swing in income month to month, and the same, even higher consumption. And 30% of people, a quarter of people, will have a 30% swing in income month to month. It's a very different dynamic than a steady sort of increase or flattening of wages. And what was, I think, most interesting is that in the field that looks at low-income communities, this is well known, that it gives rise to really serious liquidity issues, meaning that people can't match income and consumption. What we found is this level of volatility is true across all income quintiles. First, second, third, fourth, fifth, and it's only the fifth quintile that is able to withstand it. So we conducted, in effect, a stress test on households to say, imagine the stress that comes from a household if you have unexpected drop in income, unexpected increase in consumption, healthcare or a car breaks down, and think about that as the volatility you could be exposed to. And so we map up from the observations, and we find that vast majority of households are not equipped to deal with that volatility. So median individual should have $4,800 a month to withstand, in liquid assets, to withstand that volatility. Typically, they have $3,000. This is true for every quintile level except the top that actually have enough of liquid buffer to withstand volatility. So it's a source of real anxiety you can understand, not captured by the traditional data sources,
right.
which...
But even though you do see it across the board, you see it more predominantly in certain groups. Which
Yes.
are those groups, and why do you suspect that they're suffering from more volatility than
Yeah,
others?
we do. We do see it across the board, but it is more pronounced in low-income households, as many have documented, but we are able to see that very clearly. It's younger people, and those often go together, lower income and younger, but not always. So even after you hold everything constant, lower income, younger people will experience more volatility regardless of income level. And regionally, you have a concentration in the West. So people on the West Coast will typically have higher levels of volatility than in other parts of the country. And you had asked me earlier, do we have insight into that? I think on the West Coast, part of it is that you have higher incidence of contractor work, and that tends to drive more volatility. And some of that is by choice. People want more flexible arrangements, and other is just by necessity. And you have an industry mix that lends itself much more to that model on the West Coast.
And one of the things you found is, I mean, volatility goes in both directions. There's downward dips, which are more common than the peaks, but the peaks are of greater magnitude. Exactly. Can you talk about what causes the downward dips versus what causes the peaks and why we see those patterns? Yeah,
so I think one of the things that we decided to double down on is told you the extent to which people experience volatility. You said, what's going on? First hypothesis was, oh, it must be all the churn in jobs that people have. And it turns out, we document this with our data, but the census would say the same thing. 4 out of 10 individuals will face a job transition over the course of a year. They'll lose a job, they'll gain a job, they'll switch a job. And it turns out those people do experience quite a bit of volatility as a result of that. But that's not the story. The real story, the vast majority of the volatility across months is within job volatility. And that was a big surprise to us. And that has 2 components. One, you might not be so worried about, but it's interesting, which is paycheck frequencies. So some months have 5 weeks, some months have 4 weeks, and you never know which months those are. So that gives rise to some of that. Maybe you don't worry so much about that. But the rest of it, the majority of the within job volatility is actually changes in payroll amounts. So why, you say? Well, a number of different things. One, hours worked. And so some of the highest employment sectors, construction, retail, hotels, et cetera, have variable hours worked depending on seasons, depending on all kinds of things. The increase in contractor work, which some have pointed to, although if we turn to the gig economy, I'll say that part of it maybe has been overstated. And just more commission-based types of things that have variability based in them to begin with.
Turning to that gig economy question, this report also looked at the rise in the gig economy. What are you seeing in how many people are participating, and what impact is it having on their earnings?
Yeah, this is a great question. I would say, in some ways, this is a wonderful example of what we're being able to do to contribute to the public debate at the Institute. A number of good work has been done in this area. Alan Kruger and Harris recently did a survey, which was very good on this. But as surveys are, expensive as they are, they're relatively small samples. We were able to identify 260,000 people who have participated, meaning they have earned income on the online platform economy, as we call it. And let me just pause for a minute. It's really, definitions are important here. So just very briefly, we describe what some call the gig economy as the online platform economy, concentrating on what is new about this. And we say an online platform economy has 4 characteristics. One, it connects buyers and sellers directly, so through a platform. So when you want to go get a car on Uber or Lyft, you go on there, Airbnb, et cetera. It is work that the worker decides when they do it, not the employer. That's very important to how we think about this. It's piecemeal. You get paid for a task or a product or a rental of a room, not on a retainer basis of any sort. And it's intermediated by the platform. So the payments in both directions are actually centralized, and that becomes important for different reasons. And so that's our definition, online platform economy. And one more distinction, and then I'll get to your answer, is labor platforms. So you're providing a task or service. You're driving somebody, you're walking their dog, you're shopping for them. That's labor platforms. Capital platforms, you are renting an asset like Airbnb, you are selling a product like Etsy. And it turns out that distinction is really important to answer your question. So what do we know about, first of all, the growth? It's phenomenal. In the last 3 years, we've seen a 47-fold growth in the number of people who participate. And a lot of people get excited about that number, as we should, but calibrated by, even when all is said and done, by the last numbers we saw, it's 1% of adults have participated on either labor or capital platforms. And it's more capital platforms than labor, but both are growing pretty significantly.
It was 1% in a month, right?
In the last month that we saw it.
Right.
So that's 2.5 million people in the U.S. Over the last 3 years, it was 4%. 10 million people have earned income on the online platforms that we looked at based on our study. And so that's important, and I think it's the growth that's more important than the base, because the base is still pretty small. But that's the first thing I'd notice. The second thing I'd say about it is that for the vast majority of people, it's supplemental income. Most of these have another source of income. So depending on whether you're talking about how much of the income is in that month or how much of this income was over the course of the year, you're talking about 20 to 30% of income comes from these platforms, which means people are really relying on another job for the most part. Supplemental, people come in and out of it, so the difference between the 2.5 million and 10 million is that people don't necessarily do it every month. They will do it some months when they want. And now we come to an important distinction between labor and capital platforms. Who participates, who earns income matters a lot. There's a big difference between labor and capital. So labor, it's younger people, it's lower income people, whereas capital, it's actually slightly higher income than the census population as a whole, and there's really no age difference. You have age groups across the board. One distinction which you asked me about, Rebecca, was different between the two also. Labor platforms are predominantly male, 67% male, whereas capital platforms are evenly half and half. I think it's still small, growing phenomenally fast. It is a supplemental form of income that people come in and out of. And I think maybe to the income volatility connection, which is an important one here, we found that in the case of labor platforms, it is serving to offset income volatility, so that we see if the traditional source of income is dropping, people are more likely to go and earn income on the online platform economy, and it's more likely to be the extent to which the fall hits. So it's offsetting that. And in that way, it's a very positive development, because we are very, and I think should be, concerned about this income volatility question, and to the extent that it's providing a mechanism for people at their choice to offset it, it's good. We don't see that offset on the capital side. It's just supplemental. People are sort of getting a little extra cash to go with it. But on the labor side, it's an interesting dynamic.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about since the Atlantic cover story came out this month by Neil Gabler, and he'll be speaking later today, he has this statistic that kind of frames up his piece, that 47% of Americans couldn't afford a $400 payment, emergency payment, if they needed to. And I looked into that statistic a little more, and one of the things that I found that was really shocking, it's a smaller percent, but 27% of people earning $100,000 or more couldn't come up with $400 in a month. So what we see here is that even at higher ends of earnings, spending and consumption really catches up to people. So when you see this supplemental earning from something like Airbnb, do you see people, and you guys have looked at this in other reports as well,
yes.
Do you see people saving that money, or is it going into consumption?
So let me come to the first part of what you said, because I think it might answer the second. One of the most interesting things about the initial report that we did, which was mapping income volatility and consumption volatility, was that we thought that people would be highly responsive, meaning a drop in income would result in their curtailing consumption and vice versa. And what was surprising is to learn that these two do not co-vary. So you could have a simultaneous drop in income and an increase in consumption. They actually don't move in tandem, which is why the stress test concept I mentioned before is really meaningful. It means you could simultaneously experience a drop in income when you saw an income in consumption. Long way of saying, no, people do not seem to be systematically saving their rise in income, but they also don't seem to be systematically spending it. It's kind of all over the map. Overall, what we see is most people, not just low-income people, but a large number of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck.
Right. Right.
which is why even at the $100,000 level, they don't have that $400 emergency fund.
You see that people are using platforms like Uber to smooth the income volatility shocks that they are experiencing. But overall, there's a footnote in your report that pointed to that overall economists believe that income volatility is increasing in the economy over the past several decades, 4 decades, I think it was. How much of that is just our ability to see it better because of better data versus is there something actually changing in the economy? Do we even know?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that this dynamic of the online platform economy is really important because it's growing so fast. But let there be no mistake, at 1% of adults on any given month, it's not what's driving the volatility at large. There's a much bigger phenomenon. And we see over the period of time that we've been observing this now, we have the data asset for 3 years, the volatility has been high throughout that period. As you mentioned, there was work by Karen Dinnan and others that suggests that since the 70s, we've had increases in income volatility. I don't know that we know that because the measurements back, apples to apples, we don't know. And I think we were always looking at annual numbers that are sort of aggregating a lot of volatility. We see that, for example, in a lot of the work we're doing more broadly on the consumer side, on the consumption side, which is that almost by definition, a lot of economic estimation models try to smooth out volatility. Say, oh, we're going to take out seasonality. We're going to take out, this particular weather pattern. And our view is, well, the way people live is the take-home paycheck. Mm-hmm. And so we're not interested in only in the macro picture. We're actually interested in the economic and financial lives of people. And we haven't had these measurements before now.
Right. I'm going to give you one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But can you just tell us some of the things that you guys are looking at doing with this data in the future? What are other kind of areas of our knowledge about the economy that are still fuzzy, that can benefit from this level of granularity?
Well, you can imagine. You can start imagining all we could do, and as you can see, I'm so excited about it. But there are questions that we've tackled but will continue to tackle that are very hard to answer with the aggregate data. What are people doing with the savings at the gas pump? Turns out that's really hard to answer. When gas spending is only 5% of total consumption, if you're trying to isolate, well, how much of it was not, our data lend itself very well to that. We answered that question for the peak to trough drop in gas prices, a 45% drop in gas prices. But we're going to come back to saying, well, now the gases has remained low, what do we know? That's on the plate. We also have a whole list of interesting questions. Last year in January, 20 states increased the minimum wage. And as you all know, there's a huge policy question, which is, which wins out? Is it the increase in price that kills supply and demand, and therefore you're just going to create unemployment? Or is it you got to pay people for them to spend, and the demand side that dominates? And I think in some ways, that's a debate that's playing out in many states and many cities, and I think we're going to be able to provide some real fact base to that, we hope. That's on the plate. More generally, we will continue to build the full range of assets around income, consumption, balance sheet issues, liabilities. Student loan is a big question. How does the burden of student loans affect long-term consumption for individuals? I think we can answer some of those questions. So that's all in the vein of what do we know about the household sector, individuals, families. But we also want to inform other sectors of the economy. So we've launched a new data asset on small businesses, which I would argue is another area where there's a lot of political narrative, but not a whole lot of facts. And we hope we can really contribute to that through the window that we have. And we are beginning to explore what we might do on the market side. So financial markets, for those of you who live in that world, the data at a global level are really, I mean, they're good, they're better than nothing, but they could be dramatically improved on. And I think we can answer some really interesting questions around what do we really know about the investor landscape and how big policy movements, QE, otherwise sort of shift transmission mechanisms across investor positions and investor activity, which will be really important for questions of monetary policy and even fiscal policy.
All right, we'll open up for questions for Deanna. I see one back there. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Joanna Brignolo. Thank you for your information. I'm just curious, you collect this data and then you're directing it to be used by the government, but how do you feel that the the individuals in the different platforms, how do they come to understand your data and make changes? How many people who are in the survival mode, how do they adjust to know that there is a new discipline that you can effect in order to understand how you're spending money? I'm not sure people understand what how they're expending their resources.
No, you're right. I think a lot of people don't, and we are definitely trying to contribute to an effort to disseminate this information, not just to policymakers who need to know it, and there are things that can be done, but also through efforts, for example, our foundation has been working with CFSI, which is the Financial Services Innovation Group. It's a non-NGO here in DC, that to set up a program to help find solutions to this liquidity issue. And so we've issued prizes to business entrepreneurs that have come up with applications that, for example, one called Even, that helps people match their income. They take these highly volatile income and consumption flows and try to smooth them by alerting people as to where they are in a cycle, for example. So there are interesting initiatives like that. And I think we're working very closely with a number of partners here, Pew, CFSI, others, to help reach out on this issue. We come to the view that this financial literacy issue, financial education issue, is not going to get resolved by literacy. That is clearly not working that well. So these are other tacks we're taking. But we like to think that some people will go to our website and read our reports and maybe alter their behavior. Hopeful thinking, I know.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. We always talk about economy. We always talk about a balanced budget. The problem now is we never talk really about how individual employee or the new labor force, they are really contribute to the productivity, or the existing labor, they would contribute to their productivity. I really mean good service or good product, not the disservice or dysfunction. Currently, now, Department of Labor, they try to promote apprentice or promote the IT. The problem is now, you can see almost every agencies, they create a website with almost restricted input. So you don't allow people to contribute or comment the problem of our economy. So could you tell now, when we have a job there, could you tell just how much percentage of who are the new workers, what occupation, or who are their employers, and whether employer receives special subsidies?
You know, I think you make a lot of good points. You mentioned the productivity issue that I think is one of the places where the measurement issues are coming to be really challenging. I think we see these historically low productivity rates and we don't know whether we're just measuring this wrong or whether there's something profound. So hopefully we'll be able to inform some of that. I think you mentioned some other issues around the role of different governments in helping drive employment, and I think there are many efforts focused on that. I think our efforts so far have been on the economic and financial well-being of households, and there's obviously the connection with the labor markets that you bring up, but thank you for your comment.
That's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us. This was so
Thank you
helpful.
for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.